I'm Chloe Jensen. Until 2 hours ago, I was the senior systems engineer at a tech startup called Cornova, based in Austin, Texas. I had been with them for 5 years through every growing pain product pivot and funding round. This morning, I walked into the CEO's office thinking we were going to discuss the new security integration I'd finalized over the weekend. Instead, I was handed a severance letter and told my role was no longer necessary. Brandon, our CEO, didn't even look up from his laptop as he dismissed me. What he did say was this: "Don't worry, no one will remember your contributions anyway. That line hasn't stopped ringing in my head, not because I believe it, but because I think deep down he wanted it to be true." I sat there for a few seconds longer than I should have, just absorbing it. Not the job loss I'd felt that coming, but the complete erasure of everything I had poured into that company. The endless hours, the team building, the code I wrote at 3 a.m. was when systems were crashing. All of it reduced to a digital signature and a closed laptop. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just nodded, thanked him for the opportunity, and walked out like a professional. That's always been my way: stay composed, no matter how much it burns inside. But inside, something cracked. As I walked past the open office I used to help design, I saw engineers still using my codebase, still referencing architecture I'd mapped out on whiteboards back when we were renting a dusty co-working space downtown. One of them looked up and asked if I was heading out early. I smiled, said something vague, and kept walking. I don't think anyone knew. No goodbye, no Slack message from HR. Just a quiet exit with my coffee mug and a small succulent I'd managed to keep alive through 5 product launches and 1 acquisition offer. I stood in the elevator holding my canvas tote and suddenly felt weightless. Not in a free way, more like something important had been dropped, and I wasn't sure what remained. There was a time when I would have accepted that silence, when I might have agreed with Brandon that maybe people wouldn't remember what I built. But I'm not that girl anymore. And what Brandon didn't know, what none of them knew, is that I'd already made sure my work, my name, and my value wouldn't be so easily erased. What hurt the most wasn't the severance or the blindsiding. It was that after everything I gave, he still thought I could just be quietly forgotten, that I was never meant to be seen. He was wrong. And I think deep down he knew it too. When I joined Cornova, we didn't have a name yet. Just 4 of us were cramped into the back of a shared workspace with spotty Wi-Fi and a whiteboard that we'd wiped so many times the surface was permanently ghosted. Brandon had the vision, sure. But it was my code that gave it life. We had no air conditioning that summer, and Austin heat doesn't play nice. I remember typing through sweat, my fingers slipping on the keys, while I debugged a prototype that kept failing overnight. There were nights I slept on a beanbag because there wasn't time to go home and come back, not if we wanted to meet that pitch deadline. I built the first version of our authentication system in that space, borrowing pieces from a personal project I'd started while freelancing. It was a side challenge back then, something I tinkered with on weekends to make login protocols smarter and more resilient. I never imagined it would become the spine of a multi-million-dollar product, but it did. When we finally launched, it was my system that allowed us to scale fast without compromising user security. Investors asked how we pulled it off with such a small team. Brandon smiled and talked about our innovative approach, but he never said my name. I didn't care at first. I was focused on the build. We raised our seed round, then Series A, $10 million, a bigger office, and a whole new team to train. I onboarded every engineer. I rewrote the documentation to match our expansion, and still I handled every critical patch myself, sometimes deploying hotfixes during family holidays because no one else knew the system like I did. I wasn't just a developer. I was the translator between product engineering and security. I caught flaws in vendor libraries before they became breaches. I integrated a dual-factor system before compliance even demanded it. Brandon once called me the backbone of Cornova in a team meeting. That was the last time he ever used that word about me. As we grew, new hires came in fast. Fresh grads, contractors, product managers with big plans, but no idea how any of it actually runs. I became the person people turned to when systems broke, when access failed, when no one else could figure out why the platform kept timing out. I solved problems quietly and moved on. But with every new round of funding, my name moved further down the email threads. I noticed it first when a PR firm asked for names to include in a press release. I wasn't on the list. Later, Brandon started referring to the security stack as our patented system. I knew what he meant. He meant his. I worked 60, sometimes 70 hours a week. I missed birthdays. I lost touch with friends. I turned down an offer from a major firm in Chicago because I believed in what we were building. More than that, I believed in loyalty. And for a while, I thought that loyalty was mutual. There were warning signs. Brandon started holding closed-door meetings without the engineering leads. He brought in a consultant, Troy, who claimed to specialize in infrastructure, but asked me how to read my own audit logs. I documented everything, even the conversations where I explained the most basic systems I had created. I should have seen it coming sooner. What I didn't expect was how quietly it would happen. No warning, no discussion, just a calendar invite and a final conversation where my entire career at Cornova was summed up in a sentence about how things had evolved beyond my role. It felt less like a goodbye and more like erasure. Looking back, I realize how naive I had been to think the work would speak for itself. The code didn't have my name on it in literal terms, but every function, every test, every corner case accounted for that was mine. I knew the logic, like my own handwriting. Because it was mine. So when Brandon said no one would remember my contributions, what he really meant was that he hoped no one would. That if he buried me under layers of new hires and vague titles, the truth might fade. But the truth doesn't fade. Not when you've built it line by line in sweat and silence. And certainly not when you've kept the receipts. I've always documented everything. Not because I was paranoid or expected trouble, but because it's how I was raised. My dad used to say, if you build something worth protecting, make sure you can prove it's yours when the time comes. At Cornova, that habit became my shield. Every update, every architecture draft, every meeting note I took for myself was stored in a personal system I maintained off hours. I never broke any policies. I just made sure my fingerprints were on everything I created. The authentication system, which had become the backbone of our platform, was built using my own custom structure. I used a unique shorthand in the internal documentation that only made sense to me. The devlogs had layers that required contextual knowledge of how the system had evolved from its earliest prototype. No one else on the team ever bothered to understand it in full. They relied on me to be there. Brandon relied on me to maintain it quietly while he took the spotlight. And I let him for a while. Until I started to notice the language changing. The way he talked about the product in investor meetings, the way he stopped referencing who built what. 3 weeks before I was fired, I started moving copies of everything. Not in secrecy, not in panic, just preparation. I archived every technical document, every version control log, and every performance analysis I had authored. I reviewed my employment contract carefully. It was standard. It protected the company's IP, yes, but it didn't say anything about the systems I had developed before I signed on. The first iteration of the authentication stack was built 6 months before Brandon even approached me with the idea for Cornova. I had the commit history, the email threads, and the design specs from my old freelance days. I didn't mention that fact often. It didn't seem relevant until I realized he might try to claim it as his own, so I reached out to a lawyer. Valerie Knowles. A quiet, brilliant IP attorney I'd met at a tech panel the year before. I sent her a full archive. I included a letter outlining the timeline of development and a list of everything I had built before I joined the company. She reviewed it and told me I was smart to get ahead of things. I didn't feel smart. I felt tired. But I was prepared. I didn't know exactly when the axe would fall, but I knew it was coming. The closed-door meetings, the new advisor is shadowing my team, the questions about whether I was still the right fit for our new direction. All the signs were there. The morning Brandon called me in, I walked in with nothing but my phone and a tote bag. But my work, my system, my proof that was already safe, backed up, time-stamped, legally documented. Brandon thought he was cutting me loose. What he didn't know was that he'd just lost the one person holding the keys to everything he was selling. And I was holding those keys with a very steady hand. It started with a text from Ethan. He was one of the newer engineers I had mentored during his first months at Cornova. Smart kid, quick learner, always respectful. His message was short and frantic. Something's broken. We've tried everything. Nothing's working. I didn't respond. Not immediately. I sat with my coffee and stared at the screen. Just 3 weeks earlier, none of them had said goodbye. Now they were scrambling for answers I used to provide without being asked. The next call came that afternoon. Joseph, the CTO. His tone was careful, almost friendly, like we were catching up instead of circling a fire. He said the team had questions. Something about my documentation being difficult to follow. Specialized, he called it. I almost laughed. I asked if Troy had taken over. He said yes, but that Troy was struggling to interpret the authentication layers. I asked what made them think I'd be available to consult. There was a pause. Then came the offer, a generous hourly rate, double what I had been making full-time. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't. I spent the rest of the day ignoring a growing stream of messages and emails. Ethan again, one of the product managers. A Slack invite I never accepted. The silence I gave them felt strange at first, but then it settled into something that felt like clarity. By week's end, Brandon himself called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was all charm and false humility. He said he hoped I was well, that he respected my decision, that they'd love to bring me back temporarily just to help them transition through some technical bumps. I called my lawyer instead. Valerie told me to hold. She said they were playing the early hand too fast. That if they were already circling back, they were more desperate than they wanted to show. She advised we say nothing. Let the silence grow heavy. So I did. I didn't reply to Brandon's email. I didn't answer Joseph's second call. I read every message they sent, but I didn't write a single word back. I went on walks. I read novels. I slept better than I had in years. By the time Brandon's second offer came through 6 figures for 3 weeks of consulting, I felt no temptation. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. They hadn't just cut me loose. They had bet on my absence being irrelevant. Now they were learning just how wrong they were. I crafted a single-line reply. I'm currently unavailable. Wishing you the best. That was it. I didn't know them more. They had made their choice. Now I was making mine. The knock came late on a Thursday afternoon. I opened the door and found Olivia Grant standing there. She was one of the senior partners at Argentum Capital, the firm that had led Cornova's Series A round. We had met once briefly at a product demo Brandon had staged in our old office. Back then, she shook my hand, nodded politely, and spent the rest of her time in a deep conversation with Brandon about market strategy. Seeing her now outside my house felt surreal. She didn't waste time. She said there had been questions raised by the board, concerns about the system's failure, and the lack of transparency around Cornova's technical leadership. She asked if she could come in. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She sat on my couch and pulled out a file. She said they'd reviewed internal documents, investor decks, and recent technical reports. And something wasn't adding up. Brandon had presented the authentication system as his own vision. There were no references to me anywhere. She asked me a direct question. Did I build the system I told her I did? From the first line of code to the last integration check, it had been mine. I showed her the documentation, the original repo timestamps, emails from Brandon years ago acknowledging my prototype. Her face stayed neutral, but I saw it in her eyes. Something had shifted. She closed the folder and said the board would be holding an emergency meeting the next day. She wanted me there, not as a guest, as a witness. I called Valerie. She reviewed everything, including the files I had shared with Olivia. She advised that we send a formal notice that night, a legal notification of retained IP. By the time I walked into that boardroom, the company would already know what they were up against. The next morning, I dressed carefully, neutral tones, confident but unprovocative. When Valerie and I walked into Cornova's headquarters, heads turned. The whispers followed us down the hallway. We entered the boardroom. Brandon was already seated at the head of the table. He looked up, saw me, and froze. The other board members nodded politely. Olivia introduced me formally and then turned to Valerie. Valerie handed out printed copies of the IP notice. Brandon immediately objected, saying I had signed an agreement. I replied calmly that the authentication system had been developed prior to my employment. I had proof. I connected my laptop to the conference display. I showed the repository the commit history and the original documentation. I showed an email Brandon had sent thanking me for bringing my prototype to the team. Then I displayed slides from their investor deck. The system is listed as a competitive advantage. No credit, no mention of me. One of the board members, a man I didn't recognize, leaned forward and asked Brandon directly, "Did you know she built this before joining?" Brandon stammered. He said I had contributed, that I had worked under his supervision. I turned to Joseph, the CTO. I asked him on the record whether anyone on the current team could maintain the system without me. He looked exhausted. Then he said no. He confirmed I was the principal architect, the only one who understood the full logic. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind that settles before something snaps. Olivia looked at Brandon and said they would reconvene privately. We stepped out. 15 minutes later, they called us back in. Olivia stood and addressed the room. The board had reached a decision. Effective immediately, Brandon would step down as CEO. His misrepresentations had jeopardized the company's credibility and stability. Then she turned to me. She said the board was offering me the role of CTO with full equity compensation, with formal recognition of my contributions, with public correction of the record. Valerie looked at me. I nodded. I wasn't there for revenge. I didn't need applause. I just wanted the truth restored. And that day, it was. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected. After the board's decision, I stepped into the role of Chief Technology Officer not just in title but in responsibility. There was no ceremony, no applause. Just a quiet transfer of authority that felt both surreal and justified. Brandon cleared out his office the next day. He didn't speak to anyone. Word spread quickly, but the team stayed focused. They were tired, stretched thin from weeks of uncertainty and system failures. I didn't walk in and demand loyalty. I just got to work. My first order of business was rebuilding the engineering culture. I opened up the documentation, made it readable. I hosted open review sessions, brought junior devs into core meetings, and rewrote access policies so no one would ever be left out of critical knowledge again. What I had once protected in isolation, I now distribute with intention. It wasn't about holding power. It was about ensuring that what we built together would never hinge on a single person again. I watched the team start to relax slowly, trusting the new structure. Productivity improved. Downtime dropped. More importantly, people started to feel seen. 3 weeks in, we pushed a full system update. No errors, no rollbacks, just a clean deployment that restored client confidence and stabilized our internal metrics. I stood at the front of the office watching our support team high-five each other. It felt quiet, not triumphant, but right. That night, I received an email. The sender's name stopped me. Brandon. The message was short. He said he owed me an apology, that he should have valued what I built, that the company was better in my hands. I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't anger I felt, it was distance, like looking at something from a former life and realizing it no longer had power over you. I replied with a single sentence. Thank you for your message. I wish you well in whatever comes next. Valerie asked if I wanted to make the exchange public. I said no. Some things aren't meant for show. I didn't need the world to see that I had won. I just needed to know that I had done the right thing for the right reasons. Leadership didn't change me. It clarified me. I no longer felt the need to prove my worth by overextending or staying invisible. My role was now built on clarity, collaboration, and accountability, the opposite of what it had been before. There was no revenge in any of it, only recognition, the kind that's earned slowly and when it finally comes, doesn't need to shout. It just exists. And that was enough. It's been 3 months since I stepped into this new role, and sometimes I still catch myself pausing at the door before I walk into the office. Not because I feel out of place, but because I'm finally starting to believe that I do belong, that I always did. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't being underestimated. It was how quietly it happened. One small dismissal at a time. A name was left off a slide. An idea reframed in someone else's voice. It wasn't a single betrayal. It was the slow erosion of being seen. But the truth has a strange way of surviving, even when people try to bury it, especially when they do. And what I've learned more than anything is that protecting your worth isn't selfish. It's necessary. I don't regret the work. I don't regret the long nights or the weekends sacrificed to solve one more bug or prepare one more release. Those moments taught me resilience. What I do regret is staying silent for so long, letting others define where I fit and what I was allowed to take credit for. If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, it would be this: document everything. But also document yourself, your decisions, your wins, your boundaries. Not because you expect conflict, but because one day you might need to remind yourself of just how much you've built. This wasn't about revenge. It was about not letting someone else rewrite a story I lived and bled for. It was about standing still long enough to let the dust settle and see who I really was beneath the roles and titles, and then choosing to protect that person with everything I had. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a quiet office with a team that trusts you, a stable platform, a clean deployment, an inbox with no fires, and a night's sleep that doesn't carry bitterness. I didn't win because Brandon lost. I won because I remembered what mattered before anyone else did. I honored the work. I respected the people. And in the end, I respected myself. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever watched someone else take credit for what you built, if you've ever questioned whether speaking up was worth the cost, let me tell you this: you are not small, and you do not need to stay silent to survive. Your value doesn't disappear just because someone else refuses to see it. Keep your proof. Keep your dignity. And when the time comes, step forward, not to fight, but to be counted. I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been underestimated only to prove you were the one holding everything together all along? I'd love to hear your story.